Okay, we're going to need to kick this thing off momentarily here. So, if you'll be making your way to your seats, we'll get things started here in just a second. Wow, got quiet, didn't it?
Got scared.
Scared. Sir, uh-oh, got something wrong back here, it looks like. It's going to be a couple minutes. You guys have heard this principle before, when in doubt, reboot. So there we go. Okay. Well, we're still in John. I know that's a shock to you. And today we're going to start working our way into chapter 7. But the important thing that I want for you to see from what we've just concluded is that chapters 5 and 6 set the stage for chapters 7 through 10. And now that we've concluded chapters 5 and 6, we need to see where we're at in order to see where we're headed in chapters 7 through 10. So just as a brief review of what we saw in chapters 5 and 6, there were some differences between these chapters, but there are also some similarities. The biggest difference is the location. Chapter 5 took place exclusively in Jerusalem. Chapter 6 took place up in Galilee. In Jerusalem, you'll recall the event was that a lame man was healed, where up in Galilee there were 5,000 who were fed, and then Jesus walked on the water and calmed the storm. But notice also that another difference between the two chapters was the target audience. In Jerusalem, the target audience was this group that John refers to over and over again as the Jews. And what he's talking about there are the Jewish authorities, the religious aristocracy, the religious leadership, those who were in charge, those who had religious authority. Whereas in Galilee, the people that were being targeted and were being challenged by Jesus were those whose faith was not yet mature. They were capable of doubt, all right? And that was the audience that he was working with in Galilee. But there also, in spite of those differences, there were some great similarities between chapters 5 and 6. Both chapters began with a miracle or a couple of miracles, followed by Jesus teaching and his instruction, and then we see the reaction of those who were present. And both chapters follow that type of a format. And then the other thing we want to observe about the format of these two chapters is that when Jesus teaches, he's teaching something that's directly related to the miracle that he has just performed. So, for example, in chapter 5, when he heals a lame man in the temple, immediately there, not in the temple, but in the near the pool, I'm sorry, when he heals that lame man, then he begins to speak about the special power he has been given by the Father, and he speaks in detail about his relationship with his Father. In chapter 6, when Jesus feeds 5,000 men, then women and children on top of that, with bread, then he goes on to talk about the fact that he is the bread of life. And so the nature of the miracle becomes the focus of Jesus' teaching in both cases. But the other similarity, and this is the one that leaves us in chapter 5 and 6 ready for chapter 7 through 10, is the outcome. And the outcome is similar but different. The outcome in chapter 5, the Jews are now openly hostile to Jesus. And they are looking for ways to kill him. And if you want a verse on that, take a look at chapter 5, verse 18. But then if we take a look at chapter 6, we see Jesus as, again dealing with those whose faith was superficial and marginal. And Jesus was proving that he is totally different from the Messiah that they expected. And so their expectations were being thrown all over the place. And not only their expectations, but their desires. What they wanted from their Messiah, most of all, was freedom from Rome. And they wanted to throw off the oppression of the Roman government. And so Jesus seems to have no interest in that. And so that's challenging these Jews because of their preconceived notions of who he was and what he would do and what their Messiah would perform for them. And so Jesus was proving to be utterly different, and they were, in many cases, unable to put aside their preconceived notions and ideas of what he would and should be like. And so according to chapter 6 and verse 66, it says, many then stopped following and turned back and no longer followed Jesus. And so their doubt got the best of them. But it was because they were dealing with these preconceived ideas and notions. And so now, so now we move into chapter 10. Chapters 7 through 10. And in 7 through 10, what we're going to see is we're going to see several different scenarios occurring. But in all of these, the tension between Jesus and his opposition is growing and increasing. And both sides of this chasm are becoming entrenched. They're getting stuck where they're at. Jesus and his close disciples on one side, and then his opponents on the other. His opponents continue to fall into two different groups. There's a group of them who wants to just preserve the status quo. And that's the Jews in Jerusalem, the people who have the authority, who have the power. They have the money. And these are the people who want things just to stay like they are. They see Jesus as somebody just trying to change everything, and most of all trying to take their authority away from them. But then the second group of people are those with different ideas about what Messiah would do, and so that group of opponents has a different agenda. They just want Jesus to be their military and political leader. And they want him to throw the Romans out. They want to overthrow the existing Palestinian government, and they're ready to just see all kinds of change occur. Okay, so another thing we want to see as we move into chapters 7 through 10 is that now the location becomes fixed, almost for the entire rest of the book. We will only leave Jerusalem briefly in chapter 10. At the very tail end of chapter 10, verses 40 through 42, we will see that Jesus went back out into the wilderness where John had been baptizing. But aside from that now, we will be stuck in Jerusalem the whole rest of the time. So this is now the arena of those who are in power. And Jesus is drawing this conflict to a head. All right? So the location becomes fixed. Secondly, we want to talk a little bit about the timing of chapter 7 through 10 and where it falls in Jesus' time here on earth. Remember that chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000, was just around the time of Passover, which of course is in the spring of the year. All right? Now this chapter 7 begins with the Feast of the Tabernacles. Feast of Tabernacles is in the fall. That's right. The Feast of Tabernacles is in the fall. So this is about 6 months after chapter 6 took place. But then coming before long will be the next Passover, and the next Passover will be Jesus' last Passover on earth. And so where we're at here is at the midpoint between these two Passover events. And Jesus is now, starting in chapter 7, with the coming of the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus is now up to the point where he's 6 months away from finishing his ministry here on earth. So we're getting to the tail end of this, and as we said when we started the whole book of John, we said John focuses almost exclusively on the last year of Jesus' life, and a lot of it is the last week of Jesus' life. But that's where we are now, and it's kind of like we're looking at this short period of time with a magnifying glass so that we can see it in a lot of detail. And John is the only one that tells us about these specific events. But where he's going to take us in chapters 7 through 10 are through a number of confrontations that occur in Jerusalem during these last 6 months. Okay? We also have one other point of dating that we can use in this text, and that's in chapter 10, verse 22, where John records that this was the time of the Feast of Dedication. The Feast of Dedication is another name that's code for Hanukkah. And so that's a winter holiday. So 1022 occurs December, January-ish, and then by the time we get to chapter 11, we are into the spring of Jesus' final Passover. So this is all happening. It's kind of like a crescendo that's been building up. And now we're kind of getting to that point where we will see the climax actually beginning to take shape. Okay, so I think that's all that I wanted to say as an introduction. Let's turn now to chapter 7, and we'll take a look at Jesus as he begins to teach at the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, there is, I think I put this on here, yeah, there is a little bit of an outline that's available for you. Verses 1 through 13 are the people that are anticipating Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem for the feast. And we'll read about that and study about that today. In verses 14 through 36, Jesus arrives at the feast and begins to teach. But then in verses 37 through 52, we see the final day of the feast, and then we see the people reacting to Jesus. And specifically, we see the powerful people reacting to Jesus. Okay. So, let's read chapter 7, verses 1 through 13. And as we're going through this, I want you to think of two things. One is, think about the severity of Jesus' situation. And I want you to look for that in this text, but also take a look at how alone Jesus seems as he's going through these things. Chapter 7, verse 1. After this, and of course he's talking about after those from chapter 6 had begun to desert him, Jesus went around in Galilee, purposefully staying away from Judea because the Jews there were waiting to take his life. But when the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, You ought to leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples may see the miracles you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world, for even his own brothers did not believe in him. And therefore Jesus told them, the right time for me has not yet come. For you, any time is right. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that what it does is evil. You go to the feast. I am not yet going up to this feast, because for me the right time has not yet come. And having said this, he stayed in Galilee. But however, after his brothers had left for the feast, he went also, not publicly, but in secret. Now at the feast, the Jews were watching for him and asking, where is that man? Among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about him. Some said, he's a good man. And others replied, no, he deceives the people. But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the Jews. Okay? So verse 1 reminds us of the severity of Jesus' situation. And we can't help but see the difference between Judea and Galilee. In Judea, people are literally waiting there to plan and take his life. John has told us about this plot that's been hatching for some time now. And then in Galilee, his popularity has waned, but he does not have the same degree of opposition and severe hatred that is felt for him in Jerusalem, at least not yet. And so as we approach it and we move into chapter 7, we can see that if Jesus makes one wrong move, he dies prematurely, okay, before the timing that has been established. So, and of course Jesus never makes a wrong move, does he? But that's how dire the situation is for Jesus. Verse 2 introduces the season to us, and it's the Feast of Tabernacles, or the feast, if you read the King James, it's the Feast of Booths. I always wondered what a phone booth was doing in the Bible when I was a little kid. I thought, what is he talking about phone booths for? But yeah, it was the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. And that was coming. Now, what was the focus of the Feast of Tabernacles? That's a question. We don't study this one much, do we?
It's a holiday today, I think.
It is. It's still celebrated. Yes. If there's I can remember when we lived in the suburbs of Detroit. Of course, that's been quite a while ago now. But when we lived in the suburbs of Detroit, out in Oak Park, there's a large Jewish population, and you will see them living in tents in the fall. You'll see many of the Jews, particularly the Orthodox, doing that. Craig, what you got?
It says here, the great feast in the Jewish year celebrating the Feast of Harvest and commemorating God's goodness to people during the desert wanderings.
Good. Yeah, that pretty well sums it up as far as what the focus of this was intended to be. Originally, the Feast of Tabernacles was to remind the people of how God had sustained them in their leaving Exodus and then wandering through the wilderness for 40 years. And they lived in tents. But God also dwelled in a tabernacle at that time, and he lived with the people of Israel. In his presence with the people of Israel was celebrated by the tabernacle that they had constructed according to the instructions that he gave them up on Mount Sinai. So tabernacling was all about living together. And so the Feast of Tabernacles was to remind the Jews of the experience historically that they had had with their Father providing for them in the wilderness. But in addition, because it's a fall holiday, it's also a celebration of harvest and the way that God brings about what his people need. And so those two things sort of morph together, and they become a celebration of God's care for his people and the way he provides for his people. Oops, I got a little bit behind. Exodus and wilderness, harvest, and then God's provision for his people. But later on, another theme emerged with regards to the tabernacle feast, And this is that it became linked to God providing water for his people. And this happened after the prophets began to write. And there's a couple different places we want to look at briefly this morning. The first is from Zechariah, chapter 14, verses 16 through 19. And listen to what the prophet Zechariah said. The survivors from all the nations that have attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, and to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. If any of the people of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, they will have no rain. Okay, so in Zechariah's prophecy, there's this linkage of honoring God and God providing rain. And it specifically mentions this at the Feast of Tabernacles. And so this became an important element of the celebration for the Jews. And we're going to talk about that more in a week or two, and how Jesus uses this in his teaching in John chapter 7. If the Egyptian people do not go up and take part, they will have no rain. The Lord will bring on them the plague he inflicts on the nations that do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. So that's Zechariah 14. But also, if we take a look at Isaiah chapter 12, in verse 3, Isaiah speaks of this water blessing. And Isaiah says, with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. Okay, and so that is also brought into the celebration of the Feast of the Tabernacles. And by the time we get to the 1st century, they've actually come up with a ritual, a daily ritual performed by the priests to honor and to recognize God's provision of water and his linking that to faithfulness and to salvation. Okay, and like I said, we will talk more in detail about that later on, but I just want to set the stage for you right now. Now, there's some other key things about this feast. We tend to think of Passover as being the feast for the Jews, being the biggest feast. But in fact, the Feast of Tabernacles was the bigger feast. And the historian Josephus wrote down, the Jewish historian Josephus wrote that the Feast of Tabernacles was both the holiest and the grandest of the Jewish feasts. And of course, there are 3 main feast days for which the Jews were all supposed to come, the males were all supposed to come to Jerusalem. There was Passover in the spring, there was the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost in the early part of the summer, the first wheat harvest, and then there's the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall. Okay? But there's some important things that we need to recognize about the Feast of Tabernacles. First of all, it lasts for a week, and on the 8th day there was a separate holy gathering or convocation, ceremony. Okay, so that was the duration. But this particular feast required a lot more preparation than the other feasts. Why? Well, number one, as with the other feasts, you had to make a journey to Jerusalem. Okay, so that's a big deal, first of all. And we can learn about the difficulty of travel when we think about Joseph and Mary going to Bethlehem, right? So 1st century travel is not, you don't just jump on Delta Airlines and fly to the other side of the country. It's not that way. So there's a lot of preparation involved for the journey. Secondly, they have to construct some sort of a homemade tent because they literally have to live in that structure. Even those who live in Jerusalem leave their homes and live in a tent or a booth for this 8-day period. And that is part of the preparation that has to go. So if you're going down to Jerusalem from Galilee, you've got to plan not only for the journey, but you've got to take your house with you, or your tent, or something to live in for that time. So it's not the easiest thing in the world. Another thing that was a possibility was that because this was the last of the 3 main feasts per year, a Jew who had missed one of the first 2 feasts could make up their sacrifices. So what that did is got the attendance up, okay? Because now they could maybe intentionally skip the Passover in the spring or the Pentecost in the early summer, as long as they made it to, it's kind of like just getting your taxes done by April 15th. There's a deadline. The deadline for the Jews is the Feast of Tabernacles. That's the point where, according to the way that Jewish law had evolved by this time, you needed to finish paying your sacrifices and making your sacrifices by the time. Okay, and then as we talked before, Josephus called this the holiest and grandest of the Jewish feasts, indicating that it was larger and there was a lot more pageantry. Well, you can imagine that's true with all these, it's very obvious that something special is going on because there's tents everywhere. Can you imagine how crowded Jerusalem must have been during one of these festival weeks? The other thing that we will mention is that even though Pentecost, we think of Pentecost being the holiday that would attract out-of-town guests because of what is listed in Acts chapter 2, and it lists people gathered from all over the earth. But even in spite of that, Feast of Tabernacles was the more likely feast that someone who is a Jew living in India or Italy or down in Ethiopia, if you were living outside Jerusalem and you were going to make your pilgrimage to Jerusalem once a year, it would be at the Feast of Tabernacles. Why? Well, Feast of Passover it's difficult to travel. That's right at the end of winter. And, the very first vestiges of spring. So a lot of places you're still dealing with winter conditions. The Feast of Weeks in the summer is just the opposite, where you're dealing with the heat. You think about the heat in the Middle East, that's a big deal. So trying to travel in the heat. Whereas you get to the Feast of Tabernacles, the climate is right so that you can travel. So Jerusalem is literally filled to the gills with people from all over the world who are Jews that have settled elsewhere. And this creates then a specific backdrop for what happens to Jesus in Jerusalem at this particular time. All right, so that was all about verse 2. Whew. There's that clock's marching on, isn't it? Verse 3. John introduces us now to Jesus' family. And we've heard a little bit about Jesus' family, but John doesn't do this in a very complimentary way. And we'll get into that. But remember that by the time John writes his gospel, the other gospels have all been written and circulated throughout the known world. And so there's information about Jesus' family that's already out there. John just adds to the list. I want you to take a peek at a couple of these things with me that would have already been known by the time John writes his gospel. First of all, in Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, we can read about some of the members of Jesus' family. Jesus left there and went to his hometown accompanied by his disciples. And when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were amazed. Where did this man get these things, they asked. What's this wisdom that has been given him, that he even does miracles? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son? And the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? And they took offense at him. And so the text here in Mark lists at least 4 brothers and an unknown number of sisters. There is a little bit of controversy as to the textual wording there, and actual whether they were half-brothers or whether they were cousins. But there's really no reason that we have to doubt that this means literally brothers. And of course, we know that some of these brothers had prominent roles in the church later on, but not yet. Now, question 4 says something, verse 4 says something interesting. Jesus said to them, he responds to those people, and particularly to his family, only in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own house is a prophet without honor. Why is that true?
Because they know everything about him. They've grown up with him. So
Yeah.
You know, and that's so true across the board.
Yeah, it's that degree of familiarity. You know about the skeletons in the closet, whatever there were. Now, I don't think there were any with Jesus. I don't think they would have found many of those problems. But you know, Jesus' life, Jesus' history had some peculiar twists to it. And think about the rumors that must have been floating around his hometown about Mary and Joseph and the circumstances of Jesus' birth. Not everybody, I'm sure, believed that that was an act of the Holy Spirit. And so, you know, what were Joseph and Mary really up to back in those early days? And so that type of a reputation was the one that Jesus undoubtedly grew up with. Turn back a little bit in Mark to chapter 3. I'm going to read starting in verse 20, first of all. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even to eat. And when his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind. He is crazy. What is wrong with him?" This is his family saying this about him. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, see, I think it's just like a fundamental point, because I mean, I doubt, and I could be wrong, but I doubt there were very many other 12-year-olds that were running away from home to go reason about the scripture. So they should have seen it and they should have known, but it's just, it is what it is.
It's human nature, though, to doubt and to question and to think, well, I'm just as good as he is. So, you know, this stuff, it can't be true. It cannot be true. You know, but of course it was. Then you read on down in this same chapter, Mark chapter 3, verse 31. Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him. They told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." And Jesus says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" "Here are my mother and my brothers," he said, as he looks around to those who are gathered with him. "Whoever does God's will is my sister, is my brother and my sister and my mother." And so Jesus even pushes his family a little bit in this incident, doesn't he? So, you know, the important thing Jesus says is what you believe about me, not our genetics. You know, what's important here is about what you believe about me. And so even Jesus' family struggled with this thing. But by the time John writes his gospel, we now know that at least James, his half-brother, and Judas, his half-brother, this is not Judas Iscariot, but his brother Jude, both had written books of the Bible. James was a leader in the church in the first century at Jerusalem. When reports would come back from the work in the Gentile areas, James was always kept aware of what was going on. James had a special audience with Jesus the day of his resurrection that we don't know anything about other than they had that special meeting. And, you know, you kind of wonder at what point did the switch flip for his family. And I kind of think that may have been it. That may have been what flipped the switch for at least James. But this is the scenario that these brothers face. And now we come back to chapter 7 of John, and we read about, in verses 3 through 5, this new information that John shares about Jesus' siblings. Starting at verse 3, Jesus' brothers said to him, "You ought to leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples may see the miracles you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you're doing these things, show yourself to the world." For even his own brothers did not believe in him. And so they encouraged Jesus to go to Judea. Why do they want him to go to Judea? It was populated, it's crowded. They want him to go to the feast because this is an opportunity for him to do what? To get his stuff out there. Yeah, this is your opportunity, Jesus. If you're looking for a crowd, if you're looking to influence people, why have you been hiding in the shadows so far? And this is something that those who are with Jesus are wondering, why does he seem to be, holding back? What's going on with him? He's attracting people by his miracles, but nonetheless, he's missing some opportunities. Remember, they wanted to anoint him king, and what did Jesus do? He took off and went into the mountains, to the hills to pray. Yep. He escaped from that situation. And so what's going on here is his earthly family is showing that they're not too different from where everybody else is at this point. And they're having their series of doubts as well. And John even comes out and says in verse 5, even his own brothers did not believe him. They were having some of the same doubts. We could talk at length about some of the special challenges that Jesus must have faced, that his family must have faced in coming to faith about him. But just imagine that you're the younger sibling of Jesus Christ. You talk about the overachieving oldest firstborn son, that's him. And can you imagine attending synagogue, school, after him? It's one thing to have an older brother or sister that you followed through middle school and high school, but what about going to synagogue after Jesus was there? You don't have a chance. and it's going to really be a mess. So Jesus responds to his brothers in verses 6 through 9. I have gotten way behind here again. I have a way of doing that, don't I? That'll be good. Okay, so we're down in verses 6 through 9. Jesus responds to his brothers, and Jesus told them, the right time for me has not yet come. For you, any time is right. The world can't hate you, but it hates me because I testify that what it does is evil. You go to the feast. I'm not yet going to the feast because for me, the right time has not yet come. And having said this, he stayed in Galilee. The brothers' point of view is they don't understand the degree of hatred that Jesus is facing. They don't understand what it is to have your movements watched and for people to be looking to kill you. And that's why Jesus says, for you, any time was okay. You could go to this feast whenever you want. It's not an issue. But for me, the timing is important here. And there's a timing that will work. There's a timing that's right. The time is not right, not yet. So Jesus is seeking the right time, and the right time in Jesus' mind is always whatever is fulfilling the will of his Father. It's whatever he could do to accomplish God's will the best. And Jesus was hated because he was calling the world out as being evil. Okay? And that's obviously true. In verse 8, there's a text note that we have to pay attention to, and that is that the word yet may be a later insertion. It looks like that was in the oldest manuscripts, that word was not there. And it may be that some author later on who was passing the gospel down added that in order to avoid what looks like a contradiction. Because it looks like Jesus says, I'm not going, and then he turns around and goes, right? And so somebody just said, well, we'll change that. We'll put the word yet in there. But it in all intellectual scrutiny, it looks like that was not originally part of the text, okay? But nonetheless, it doesn't change the reality that when Jesus went to Jerusalem, he went on his terms. He didn't go as his brothers wanted him to go. His brothers wanted him to go and be a show. They wanted him just to do miracles. Well, interestingly, when Jesus shows up at the feast, he doesn't do any miracles. He teaches in this occasion. He refers back to when he healed the lame man 6 months earlier, but he doesn't do any actual miracles on this particular voyage. And so he's going on his terms, not his brother's terms. Okay. And then what we see as we conclude this morning and we look at verses 11 through 13, we see those who are anticipating Jesus' arrival. And there's descriptions about them. First of all, we see John recording the Jews who are waiting for him. We see them both in verse 11 and verse 13. Verse 11 says that they're watching for him, which we already knew about. But then in verse 13, it tells us that because those authorities were waiting for him, everybody else is a little afraid to talk because they can get in trouble too. And so they can see the danger that Jesus is facing. But in addition to those that John refers to as the Jews over and over again, there are some amongst the crowds, and there are two predominant viewpoints amongst the crowds. The first group of people is saying, he's a good man, okay? And they're just whispering, though. They're keeping it hush. They can't get too public, or they'll get in trouble with the Jews also. And then the other group in the crowds is saying, no, he's a deceiver. And it's interesting that John records this word, that he deceives the people. Because who else is known as the great deceiver? Satan. And Jesus in chapter 8 will call Satan a liar and the father of lies. And so John is setting us up for this. And what these people are doing is they're labeling Jesus with the same terminology that Jesus will use for Satan. That's how deep the division is between the two sides. Okay? And what they are calling Jesus is what Jesus will call Satan in the next chapter. So, this is the beginning of the Feast of Tabernacles. We'll move further into it next week. But you can see that the tension is just increasing as we await Jesus' arrival on the scene, and then he will begin to teach in the temple. Okay, that covers today's lesson. Thank you so much. We will we'll pick up next week and move on in chapter 7. God is good.
All the time.
All the time.